Oh wow, what a great morning. Just an extra helping of God's presence as youth sing unto the Lord and worship Him. I know God is just smiling up in heaven, and we're glad to be a part of this day. I'm glad that all of you guys made it today. I know there's a lot of people that are sick or traveling or whatever, and I hope that if you're home watching or live or later, I hope that you can maybe cast this to a larger TV and really be able to take in the information that I'm going to share today. This is probably the most preparation I've ever put in for a week and for a series. I've been really consumed a lot by the recent attack on innocent life of Jewish people 2 weeks ago. I'm sure you've seen something about it. I've spent a lot of time sifting through, unfortunately, horrific videos of teenagers being killed at a concert, families being tortured and killed in their homes in the middle of the day or early in the morning, Jewish babies being killed and heads taken off of their bodies, women raped and dragged through the streets, the most horrific, disgusting acts of evil you could ever imagine happened 2 weeks ago. And it's just brought to light some of the things that happen all the time. And almost just as bad as what we see happening over there is the celebration of it over here. College campuses, media outlets supporting the murderers, celebrating the murderers, and blaming the murdered is what's happening in a lot of places here in America. And they believe that Israel deserves this in some way, as if you could possibly imagine how an infant or a teenage girl at a concert who was just grabbed so that they could be gang raped, or when you're celebrating a holiday in your home, like we would celebrate, say, Christmas, and Christmas morning, instead of getting up with your families and celebrating one of the holiest holidays in Israel, your door is stormed with men with guns and they shoot your family in front of you. And then it's celebrated here in America. It's absolutely horrendous, and it makes me think of a verse in Hosea 6, chapter 4, verse 6, where the prophet says that my people are destroyed from the lack of knowledge. They're destroyed from the lack of knowledge. And you see, even in our nation's capital, you have people who are blaming Israel. They're blaming Israel for what's going on. And it occurred to me that most people in the world, certainly a lot of people in America, it's obvious, especially younger people, don't understand what I know about Israel. They don't know what I know about Israel. So over the next 3 weeks, I'm going to do everything I can to change that and to give you guys information that is based in truth so that you're not deceived by a lying media or social media or friends or college professors or whatever the case is. I want to make sure that you guys know the truth of what's going on over there. And you can help by making sure that you stay focused today, engage your mind. Don't let your mind wander. If you hear somebody talking or they're being distracted, just turn around and tell them to shut up. We'll out them right here in the middle of the service. I don't care. Okay? Make sure that you stay focused on this today because it's going to be a lot of history. And I didn't really stay focused in history class when I was in school, but this is really important for every Christian to understand because it has to do with the past, the present, and the future. And this is the 3-part series that I want to talk about is Israel and Palestine, past, present, and future over the next 3 weeks. Today we're going to start with the past, where Israel and Palestine came from, how we got to this point. Next week we'll talk about the present day atrocities, who Hamas is, how the demonic influence controls their thinking and the people who support them around the world, what terrorism is and stuff like that. We'll cover that next week. And then in 2 weeks, we'll talk about what the Bible has to say about the future in Scripture based on what's going on here today. So today, let's look into the past. Palestine, the word Palestine, the name Palestine, was given to this area in 135 AD. 135 AD, the name Palestine came to be. And during 135 AD, the the Roman Empire ruled the world. And the emperor's name was Hadrian at the time. And Hadrian was part of the reason that the Jewish people had fled from Israel. You remember when Jesus was alive, he predicted that the temple would be destroyed and the people would be scattered. Jesus prophesied this. Over the next 100 years, that's exactly what happened. The Roman Empire came in, they killed a lot of the Jews, they destroyed the temple, the walls to the city came crumbling down, and then the Jews were scattered. And so the Roman Empire had destroyed a lot of modern-day Israel. And in 135 AD, they wanted to wipe out any memory of the Jewish people. And so they changed the name of southern Israel from Judea to Palestine. From Judea to Palestine, because Judea was the Greek word for Judah, which was the tribe of that Jesus came from. Okay, so the province in southern Israel was known as Judea. So Hadrian, the emperor, in 135 AD, changed that to the name Palestine to erase any Jewish memory from that land, because they hated Jews. Palestine was actually never a country with its own government. It was merely a name that was given by people who hate the Jews to erase their memory. They wanted to erase the identity of Jewish people. So they named Judea Palestine because Palestine was named after the arch enemy of Israel in ancient days, which was the Philistines. Palestine, Philistine. That's the connection. Philistia, where the Philistines were from, was a small piece of land that the Philistines occupied about 1,000 to 1,400 years before Jesus came. Let's throw this map up real quick. This is a map of the Middle East, and this little section here is modern-day Israel. And right here is what's called the Gaza Strip. You've heard a lot about that because that's where all of the death and the rockets and all of the... this is where the people escaped from. They parachuted in, killed teenagers, and all that happened in this Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip used to be Philistia, where the Philistines were from. That's where the Philistine people came from, is in the modern-day Gaza Strip. Now, we know this because when God rescued the Israelites out of Egypt 1,500 years ago, He didn't want the people to go directly into the land of Israel. He didn't want them to go this way. He wanted them to go around and then come through this way across the Jordan River. Because these people, the Philistines, were insane. They were hateful, disgusting, barbarian people, and God didn't want to rescue the Israelites from Egypt and then have them go through the Philistine people. This is what He says in Exodus 13, 17, and 18. It says, when Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the Promised Land. God said if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. So rather than going right along the coast of the Mediterranean into the Promised Land, they would have had to go through that Philistine or that Palestine territory. So God led them around the other way into the Promised Land. Israel was always at war with the Philistine people. You know that King David killed many, many Philistines. That's why King Saul was jealous of him. He killed Goliath, who was a Philistine. If you remember, before David was a judge named Samson. Samson married a Philistine woman named Delilah. And then at the end of his life, he destroyed the temple, and the temple came down, he pushed the pillars away, and thousands of Philistines were killed at the end of Samson's life. So this was the arch nemesis of Israel, the Philistines. And when the Roman emperor in 135 AD wanted to really antagonize the Jews and erase the memory of Jewish people from the land of Israel, they intentionally called that land Palestine, because it was the people who caused so much hell against the Jewish people. Does that make sense so far? This is where the name Palestine came from. The Roman emperor named it Palestine because it was a group of people that hated the Jews, and they hated the Jews, so they shared that in common. So they came up with the name Palestine because it represented the Philistines of the old days. Now, since Palestinians today that live in Israel, that occupy that land, that cause so many problems, since they are Arab Muslims, you probably think that the Palestinians of old, the Philistines, were probably Arab people. The ones that gave Israel so many problems. You probably think they were Arab people because Philistines today, or Palestinians today, they say that this was their homeland, that their land was taken, and they have a right to that land. And so you would probably think that the Philistines were Arab people, but they were not. They were Greek people from the island of Crete. So they were called Cretans. So if you ever see anything with like Spartans, that's what the Philistines were. They were like Spartans. They had nothing to do with Arabs or anything like that. In fact, Palestine is not an Arabic word. Palestine is never mentioned in the Quran. It was named by the Roman Empire, and it was named after ancient people from Greece. It has nothing to do with Arab people or the community whatsoever. Fast forward from the Roman Empire time, about 1,500 years, about 1500 AD, and the term Palestine at that point was vaguely used to describe a region of where Israel is today. It wasn't like a bordered town or a bordered community with walls, and it didn't have its own government or anything like that. It was just kind of a phrase like we would say, I'm from the Midwest, or we're from New England area or something like that. It's just like a region. That's how Palestine was used around the 1500s. From 1300 to 1917, the whole Middle East was ruled by Arabs known as the Ottoman Turks. Around 1300 to 1917, there was about a 600-year period where the Ottoman Turks ruled all of the Middle East. We have a map here. Let's throw this map up. Does not stand out too well on that one, but here you can see there's Africa. So most of the northern part of Africa, and then all of this around here was all of the Muslim Ottoman Turks Empire. That's where they ruled in the world. You can see a large portion of the world. Now, this is the Mediterranean Sea, so Israel, modern day, would be right here. It would be so small, it would be really, really hard to see based on all of the property that the Ottoman Empire ruled with, okay? So, during the time of the Ottoman Empire, for those 600 years, a couple of hundred years into it, they took captive this area of Israel, of modern-day Israel, but they didn't call it Palestine. They called it Southern Syria. Southern Syria. And the people who lived in this territory never called themselves Palestinians, they called themselves Syrians, because it was the southern portion, it was south of the country of Syria. In 1917, okay, this is where you have to make yourself pay attention, okay, because this gets into some dates, I understand this, and you can go back and listen to it again if you want, but in 1917, World War I was ended, and this Ottoman Empire was defeated by countries like Great Britain and France. World War I in 1917. And Great Britain took control of Palestine, of modern-day Israel. Great Britain took control of that land, took it over from the Ottoman Muslim Arab community in the empire. Okay, so they were defeated in World War I. Great Britain had possession of what's now known as Israel. And Great Britain had a lot of Christians in the leadership, in their military, and a lot of those Christians really wanted the Jews to have a land of their own. They wanted them to be able to come back to their own homeland. Because for 1900 years, since Jesus predicted that the Jews would be scattered, they were spread out through the world, mainly in Europe, up here in this lands up here. The Jews haven't had a home for 1900 years. The Arabs in the Middle East had all of this, and this, and this. They had all of this place in the world to live, but the Jewish people of the world had no place to live. They had no home. So the British, who owned the land of Palestine now, who occupied that land, or who had taken control of that land, they decided they were going to give a small piece of land to Jewish people so that they can have their own nation. And when I say a small piece of land, I'm talking about a piece of land 1/5 the size of our state of Ohio. Great Britain possessed that land and said, we want to give this to the Jewish people so that they can have their own homeland. They can have their own nation. So out of all of this land in the world where Arabs and Muslims could live, Great Britain said, we just want to give this tiny small piece to the Jewish people. They were called Zionists. And a Zionist is somebody who believes that Jews have the right to come back to their homeland. I am a Zionist, okay? I believe that the Jewish people have a right to live in their homeland. And so, after everything that happened there, World War II, Great Britain took possession of the land. They decided to give that land to the Jewish people. And so what they did is the British signed what's called the Balfour Declaration, the Balfour Declaration, I guess it's pronounced, on November 2nd, 1917, which allowed the Jews to move back to its home state. And I thought I could tell you about this Balfour Declaration, but I thought it'd be easier to show you an actual copy of the Declaration, okay? So this was signed by Arthur Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain. Great Britain was the nation who owned and controlled that land that's now called Israel. And so they write to this committee who wants the Jews to be able to have a homeland. And he says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for Jewish people. We will use the best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of non-existing Jewish communities in Palestine already. So let me explain this for a second. Great Britain gave the Jewish people of the land of Israel, the land that's now called Israel, was called Palestine during that time. Great Britain called it Palestine for the first time. It was an actual defined nation called Palestine. They're the ones who defeated the Ottoman Empire Muslims, who occupied some of that land. It was Great Britain's property to give, and Great Britain gave it to the Jews so that they could have a nation of their own, documented November 2nd, 1917. Undisputable, absolute proof that the land was given by the rightful owners to the Jewish people in 1917. The Jews never ever stole land from anybody. It was given to them by the nation who defeated the previous occupiers of that land, Great Britain. Does that make sense so far? Okay, everybody understands this. The Jews never stole land from anybody. It was Great Britain's to give, and they gave it to the Jews because the Arabs had millions of other acres that they could live in. The only caveat, according to this, was that they were not to interfere with the religious rights of non-Jewish people, the Arabs. So the Jews said, heck yeah, we're so excited. We're going to be the best neighbors in the world to our Arab friends. If they need to borrow sugar, they can come over, they can get some sugar, and we're going to be great neighbors. And I just can't wait. And so if we go back to our Ottoman Empire map, the Jews from all of Northern Europe, Poland, Germany, Austria, a lot of those countries started coming down here either by ship or through land and started filling in the land of Palestine. In 1917, as soon as the Balfour Declaration was signed, they started coming to Palestine, making it their home. They built settlements wherever they had space. They built schools and businesses. In 1917, the same year, there weren't many people living in Palestine. Before the Jews came, it was a very sparse territory that not many people lived in because it was such ruin. There were so many ruins from centuries and millennia of battles that it was just the people that lived there were basically Bedouin homes, families, or nomads. For those of you who went to Israel, we drove by and we saw a lot of those Bedouin homes, right? Remember the blankets with the boards that they just threw up homes like that? Those are the people that had been living there for hundreds and hundreds of years. They were Muslim nomads that really didn't have a national identity. They just kind of wanted to be left alone. And we saw these homes just back in June of this year. They still live there. They love where they are. They don't want to leave. They have no problem with who's there. They just want to be left alone. And so the Balfour Declaration said, let these people be there. Don't interfere with their Muslim religion or any of that stuff. The Jews said, absolutely. That sounds great. But the Muslims around the world, around the Middle East, around that Ottoman Empire, in this green-shaded area, the ones who were just defeated by the British and the French and the other nations in World War I, they hated the idea of Jewish people having their own nation. Now, I'm not telling you this from a Christian bias. I'm telling you this because this is all stuff you can go back to and look up yourself. They hated the idea that Jewish people would have even 1 square mile of their own land. And so after 1917, when the Jews started coming into what's now the land of Israel, the Muslim countries surrounding Palestine, like Egypt, Syria, Iran, and Lebanon, sent hundreds of thousands of Muslims there to occupy the land. As Jews were pouring in, they sent Muslims to pour in at the same time. These weren't like those Bedouin families or those nomadic families. These were people who were very hostile to the Jews, and their entire purpose was to prevent a Jewish state from happening. As the first Jews were coming in, so were those hostile Arabs at the same time. Most of the Palestinian terrorists today, the ones who are taking heads off of infants and killing teenage girls at music festivals, are the sons and daughters of those people who came in there starting in 1917 to prevent the Jews from having that land. Those are the people who were there to stop a Jewish state. Not the families who had been living there for 500 years in sparse territories, but they were the ones who were just coming there for the sole purpose of preventing the Jews from having that land. That's who is causing the problems today. But the Jews didn't stop. They've been scattered for 1900 years. They weren't going to allow anything to stop them from having their own land. So the Jewish population began to grow from 1917 on. It grew fast because they multiplied through immigration as more Jews came. And for some reason, Jewish people can pop out babies like old Mother Hubbard. And so they began to expand and they grew. They gained strength. They gained weaponry. They had an army. They multiplied in numbers pretty quickly. And the more the Jews populated Palestine, the angrier the surrounding Muslim nations got. And so they began to attack the Jewish people in sick, terror-like ways. All the way back 100 years ago, they began to do disgusting suicide bombs and every sick, twisted way they could kill Jews, they started to do that 100 years ago. But with God's help, the Jews were able to defend themselves and fight back for their land. Now, stay with me. This fighting went on for about 20 years. Arab countries were sending Arabs and Muslims to populate the land. Jews were coming from Europe to populate the land. There was more fighting. And over the next 20 years, a huge shift happened in the mind of Great Britain. They went from being sympathetic to Jews to being anti-Semitic to the Jews, as did a lot of European nations. Of course, the Germans were like that, but Great Britain also started to change their mind and attitude toward the Jews. Now, why? Because when you look at what land the Muslims controlled, a lot of this over here, where the Gulf is oil lands, right? And so Arabs controlled oil land. England's way over here, and so in order to get oil to England, they had to befriend Muslim people. And it wasn't very friendly to be friendly to the Jews, knowing that you were going to be hated by the Arabs, and to cut off the oil supply to Great Britain. And so they started to change their tune toward the Jews and started to really become more friendly with Muslims. Why is that important? Well, for one, we know that those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. About 20 years after the British signed the Balfour Declaration, they started to turn on Israel. And they chose oil and money for their economy over the will of God. So this is what happened. Let's put up this next slide. The British began to pull back their commitment towards the Jewish people. In 1937, remember 20 years after the Balfour Declaration, this is what happened. This is modern-day Israel, the land of Israel, which was called Palestine. And back then it was called Palestine. In 1937, the British came up with an idea. They said, listen, you guys are both in this land now. You both want land of your own. I already gave all this land to Israel, but what we'll do is we'll give 80% of the land, all of the green, to the Palestinians. That's what the British said. We're going to give 80% of the land to the Palestinians, who just recently came here within the last 20 years to make it hell for the Jews. And we'll give the Jews 20% of the land up here around Galilee and stuff. So they gave Israel the whole land of Palestine, but then 20 years later they said, we're just going to give you 20% of it. And this white spot in between here is going to be international land that both of you guys can have, but we're going to control. Because in here is Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is a very coveted place for both the Muslims and the Jews. Right? Many of us, in June, we stood on the Dome of the Rock, where it is the oldest mosque that is still in use today. So we had a tour, and we were standing right there. So this is the plan that Great Britain said to the Jews. I know we gave you all this, but now we're only going to give you 20% of it. We're going to give 80% to Palestinians, Muslims, and we're going to take control of this middle part so that there's no fighting. The Jews said, this is bullcrap. You gave us this entire land. But we've waited 1900 years for our own nation, so we'll take it. Documented, absolute, 100% proof, indisputable. They said, we'll take it. And guess what the Palestinians said? No. Said, nope, it's not good enough. They refused 80% of the land. That should tell you right there that they don't care about the land. They care about the Jews becoming their own nation. That's all they want. And so they rejected this offer. And after this offer, the Arabs began to put more pressure on the British to stop the Jews from coming into Palestine. So 2 years after this offer, in 1939, the British made a deal with Muslims to limit the number of Jews from coming into Palestine. They said, listen, we'll put a cap on it. We'll allow 18,000 Jews to come into Palestine per year over the next 5 years. That sounds like a lot. But there were millions and millions of Jews all throughout Northern Europe that were trying to get into their ancient homeland. British said, listen, we're going to cap it off. You can fill in Palestine as fast as you want. We're going to reduce the number of Jews who are allowed to come in. Here's the problem with that. Germany had already started killing Jews at a record pace. This was a few years into the Holocaust. And so what you have is you have Northern Europe, you have Europe and Germany and Poland, all these lands that were filled with millions of Jews, and only 18,000 a year were allowed to leave to come into Israel, which was called Palestine. If you can imagine this building right here, and we've got 1,000 people packed into this building, and there started to be this toxic smoke that was emitted into the air. And if we stayed here for just, an hour or less, we would all die. And so at the door, they said, listen, we'll let 2 people out every 5 minutes. You can imagine how crazy that would be, and that there's life on the outside of that door, but only 2 people can leave every 5 minutes and be saved. That's how the Jews were trapped in Europe. They were stuck in Germany and in Poland, and the Germans would go and they would execute them, and they would kill them, and they would do things like this. This next picture just gives you an idea. It's not extremely graphic, but it's just an idea of all the dead bodies that happened during the Holocaust. Because while the Jews were stuck in Europe under the hatred of the Germans, 6 million of them over the course of several years were executed, burned alive, whatever the case is, thrown into a pit, thrown into a furnace, and their bodies removed at record pace because they were stuck there. They couldn't leave to go back to their land because the British wanted Arab oil more than they wanted to obey God. This is history. This is truth. This is not anything that I can stand before you and make up that you can't go and check for yourself. The Jews were stuck in a land that the only option was if you were lucky enough to be one of those 18,000 to leave, your life would be spared. Otherwise, you were killed in the most sick, disgusting ways. And over the next 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, the Germans would execute and kill 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. It was 1945 then when the United States, this amazing country that I absolutely love, and that's why I love our military so much, they finally had enough of this. They've seen enough, not only of the Holocaust, but of everything. And so it was the United States who took 2 atom bombs to the nation of Japan, leveled 2 cities with 2 bombs. 2 bombs dropped and completely annihilated 2 cities. The entire world watched this in shock with their jaws dropped to the floor. Never seen anything like this in their life. The United States in 1945 had become the world superpower that anybody's ever seen in the history before. As soon as those 2 bombs dropped in 1945, all of the enemies were running to the surrender literature to turn in their resignation to say, this war is over, I'm done, I don't want this happening to us. The Holocaust stopped just like that as the United States ended World War II with the atom bombs. The Jews who survived the Holocaust were now able to come into Palestine because Great Britain said, we're done with this land. They turned the land over to, it was called the League of Nations. Now we would call it the United Nations. So they gave them control over that land. And so the United Nations opened it up, probably because they were sympathetic, because 6 million Jews just died. And so Jews from all around Europe finally were able to pour into the land of Palestine, the ones who survived. Between the Jews multiplying and gaining territory from Muslim terrorists, the Jews had gained a lot more land in Palestine. So in 1947, right after World War II had ended, the United Nations made another offer to separate Palestine and Israel into 2 states. Let's go back to that graph. This is 1947. This is the offer that the United Nations came up with, because now the Jews had filled a lot more land in. Okay? And so they said, listen, you can have all of this land. This is that Gaza Strip. This is the Jordan River that comes down the east side of Israel. And so this area is called the West Bank, because it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. That's where that name comes from. So they said, you can have this land, you can have this land, and then we'll give Israel the rest. And the white will still control, because we know it's a hotbed and it's disputed, and that way we can make sure that no one country controls it. Once again, the Jews said, we'll take it. Once again, the Palestinians said, we will not take it. We don't want the Jews to have any land. In fact, 5 total land offers were made to the Jewish people between 1937 and today, and every single time, the Palestinian people, who don't really have a long history of being there, said that we refuse it. We won't take anything. They said, we won't take any offer that gives the Jewish people 1 square mile of land. You could give them 99% of this and put the Jews right at the bottom in the desert, and they won't take it. That's what they said. They won't negotiate. They won't take anything. Even Bill Clinton tried to get Yasser Arafat in the Israel community to try to come together, and they said no to everything, and he was blown away. He's like, you're not negotiating anything. That happened in 2000. So in 1947, when this offer was made, 5 surrounding nations, Muslim nations, closed in on the Jews and attacked them. They went to full-scale war against the Jews. Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. They all brought their full-strength armies with all of their artillery, and they came in and enclosed against the Jewish people. A small group of Jewish people who had just started pouring into that land only, over the previous 30 years. And something absolutely incredible and miraculous happened. The Jews won. The Jews beat 5 developed nations with full-scale armies. The Jews won. And not only won, but actually kicked their behinds in pretty good. And took some of their land. Crazy. And we know that, when you've been under this much attack, you're pretty scrappy, right? The Jews are scrappy people. Not to mention the fact that they have God Himself on their side. So in 1947, after the UN made that offer, after all of those Muslim nations came in, and they all got their butts kicked, then finally what happened is Israel was able to gain their independence as a nation. And on May 14th, 1948, the land of Palestine was, for the first time in 2,600 years, renamed Israel. Praise God, amen. Give the Lord a round of applause. That's worthy of the power of Almighty God. Israel had not, this land was not called Israel since 597 BC, when the last king of Israel left from the Babylonians, when they came and they destroyed the Jewish land. When Jesus was alive, they called it the land of Israel, but it wasn't called Israel. Northern Israel wasn't called Israel. So it had been 2,500 years and since this land was called Israel. And once again, it was called that. This fulfilled, probably second to the coming of the Lord Jesus itself, this fulfilled one of the greatest prophecies in the Bible. And I want to show you what Ezekiel 37, 21, 22 says. Read this together and read this in victory with me, will you? God says, I will gather the people of Israel from among the nations, right? They came from Poland, they came from Germany and Austria and all of those northern nations. I will bring them home to their own land from the places where they have been scattered. I will unify them into one nation on the mountains of Israel. Wow. This was written 800 years before Jesus came. Can you imagine 1,000 years ago thinking that this had any chance of ever happening? Can you imagine in the 1800s? Or during the time of the Roman Empire? Or any time, even in Jesus' day, can you imagine how crazy the Bible must have sounded? But God said, I'm going to bring you guys. Can you imagine during the Holocaust, the idea that you were going to become your own nation one day when 6 million of your fellow brothers and sisters are being murdered? This is the most deranged prophetic word probably in the entire Bible that came true, because God is God. It was fulfilled in 1948. If we go back to modern day, let's real quick, let's look up what modern day, a map of the world. This is the entire world. All of the green you see here, all of this down here, some of these out here. 50 countries in the world today, right now, where Muslims make up the majority of the population. 50 countries. What we're talking about is a little dot right here that you can't even see in this map, where the Jewish people makes up the majority of their country. There are 6 million Jews that live in the United States. There are 8 million Jews that live right here in tiny little Israel that's so small you can't even see it on this map. 8 million Jews. Think of this number, 8 million Jews in Israel. There are 2 billion Muslims in these green lands. 2 billion. One out of every 4 people in the entire world is a Muslim. And there are 8 million Jews that they are surrounding. 1 Jew for every 250 Muslims in the world, in this area right here. Think about times in the Bible where God's people were right here, and God's people's enemy was way up here. And what did God do? He reached down and He rescued His people. And He liked when they were right here because it showed His power and His glory, didn't it? This is what we've seen throughout the entire history of Israel, is God has taken a small remnant and He's allowed them to survive because He has plans for that remnant that we read about in the Bible. And He's protected them. And He raised up a nation called the United States. And the United States has, I believe, been here for the sole purpose of protecting God's nation and His people of Israel. Because when you look at Numbers 24:9, remember this, it says, "Blessed is everyone who blesses you, O Israel, and cursed is everyone who curses you." Every single nation who has come against Israel in the 4,000-year history of Israel has been cursed. Every nation who has blessed Israel, like the United States, is blessed. But here's the problem. I'm seeing support for God's chosen people, for the chosen nation of Israel. I'm seeing it diminish at record pace. You turn on the news and you see stupid kids that don't know a thing that are celebrating Palestinian murders. They're celebrating the death of children, of Jewish children, not because of any land stealing or anything like that, but the fact that they are Jewish people. And there are people in this country who used to stand for Israel that are turning on Israel the same way that Great Britain did. Why? Because there's something better that they have to offer, that the world is offering them, that the Jewish people are not. I stand here today and I tell you, as somebody who's been there 3 times and has seen the love and the support and the desire to just live in peace, I stand 100% with the land and the people of Israel because I trust in God, I believe in Him, and I know God has a plan for that land and the future of it, and I know we're a part of it as God's children. I will always defend God's promise to our ancestor Abraham and the Jewish ancestor Abraham. But as America gets farther and farther away from God, we see a nation that is not supporting Israel. And I'm going to tell you what happens to nations who turn their back on Israel become a cursed nation. And I am seeing in real time this nation go from being blessed to being cursed. And I don't say that lightly. But there are things that other nations are doing that is really making it a little bit scary for what's going on in our world today. There's a strength that's coming against surrounding nations that I don't know that we're able to stand up against here in the near future. Because our future hinges on our obedience to God. And a lot of that is listed right here in Numbers 24. We as Christians need to pray and defend and stand up for Israel and for the promise of God's word. I'll close with this. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived in the land of Israel 2,600 years before there was ever a thing called a Muslim. Islam happened, it was invented in 600 AD, around that time. Okay? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived 2,600 years before that. 2,000 years before Jesus came. 2,600 years ago, before there was one Muslim in the world that was ever invented, there were Hebrew people living in Israel. They were the only people who had ever had a national kingdom in the land of Israel, in the history of Israel. Every person that's ever occupied that land never had their own national kingdom except for the Jewish people. They should be allowed to have a piece of their own homeland that's only the size of a few Ohio counties. I don't think that's unreasonable to think. So when you see these protests and when you see stupid people believing stupid lies about these people saying they stole their land, but then you think about that map that I showed you where all of that other land that Arabs are allowed to live in and they make up the majority, it's stupid to think that the Jewish people can't have a few counties, Ohio counties, a piece of land that's that big for themselves. That means you hate people so badly that you will kill them to keep them from ever becoming their own nation. So, let me just, I know I shared a lot of information. Let me just give a few things that I want you to remember when you leave here, okay? Number 1, Palestine is a Greek name that has nothing to do with Arabs, right? It's nothing to do with any Arab, no history. It's not in the Quran, nothing like that. It was named after the Philistines, who were the enemies of Israel, and they were Greeks. Number 2, about 700 years after the Philistines were gone, long time ago, the Roman emperor renamed southern Israel Palestine as a way to erase the memory of the Jews. So I want you to remember that. Number 3, from 1516 AD to about 1917 AD, the Muslim Ottoman Empire had control of Palestine. They called it southern Syria. The Jews never, the Palestinians, the people that lived there never referred to it as Palestine. They called it Syria. Number 4, in 1917, it was the British who took control of Palestine and gave it to all the Jewish people to begin a nation of their own. We saw a document that proved that you can look up for yourselves. The Jews never stole land from anybody. It was given to them. Jews from all over Europe poured in and began settling there because of that declaration. Number 5, Muslims from surrounding countries at the same time began to send their people there to counter the Jewish population that was growing in Palestine. Number 6, After the Holocaust, after terrorist attacks, and after many miraculous victories, the Jews finally declared independence on their own nation in 1948. Palestine became Israel in 1948. Number 7, there are 7 million Jews living in Israel today, and there are 2 billion Muslims surrounding them. Israel is the only country in the world where Jews make up the majority of the population. There are 50 Muslim countries where Muslims make up the majority of their country. Still, the Jews are interested in trading land to the Palestinians for peace. Number 8, the last point I want to make is the Palestinians who came to stop the Jews were offered a Palestinian state of their own 5 different times. The first time, it was 80% of the land, and they rejected every single offer. The Palestinians who were peaceful, who were nomads, who were Bedouins, they stayed in Israel. And in fact, Israel today is made up of 20% Arabs, Muslims. 20% of Israel's population are Muslims. I'm not talking about the people in Gaza and the people in the West Bank. I'm talking about in Israel, 20% of their people are Muslims, and they actually have Muslims in the government, in the Israeli government that represent those Muslims. Something that could never, ever happen. You would never have Jewish people represented in Muslim countries. But Israel has Muslim people representing Muslims in Israel. Muslims have more freedom in Israel than they do in their own countries. But the Muslim terrorists that we see today have no history in that land except to counter when the Jews came to that land. That's who the fight is against today. So I'm going to pick up next week those 2 places that the Palestinians were pushed out to after their terrorist attacks. They were pushed into the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And so next week, I'm going to pick up there with what these terrorist organizations that they elected are, who they are, and what that means. And then the following week, we'll talk about what the Bible says about it. So I appreciate you staying focused today. Like I said, you can help educate people by sharing this and getting the word out so that people aren't uneducated and that they don't fall victim to this. But as we close, as the worship team comes up, there is no land dispute in Israel. We have to understand that. There is not a land dispute. There is a religious dispute in Israel. They don't care how much land that you give them. If it's not 100%, it's nothing. And I'll tell you this, if every one of those 7 million Jews converted to Islam, the fight would be over. Not one person will be asked to leave their land. It has nothing to do with land. It has everything to do with the Jewish faith. And it goes back to the children of Abraham. I'm going to talk about that next week a little bit. So let's close with that. And if you guys would stand with us, and I don't even know how to close today except for to say, continue to pray for these men and women and these children in Israel. Pray that God would somehow open the eyes of not only the Palestinians over there, but the people over here that are supporting evil. And God, just don't wipe us off the face of the earth. I can't even imagine, the sickness of celebrating evil like that.